Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us on this really hot day. We appreciate you coming along to talk about education and our history. So we're looking tonight at two programs of the old Communist Party of Great Britain. Most famous, of course, is the British Road to Socialism, which was first adopted in 1949, revised many times since then, amended, etc., but always reflecting really the CPGB's move away from revolutionary politics to more reformist, gradual, national, and, well, non-revolutionary politics. We could argue how revolutionary it was before, and we will. There were programs before that program in 1949. Some were adopted, some not, but always reflecting not just the struggles within the party, but also the changing relationship with the USSR and Comintern. Tonight, we're looking at two important draft programs. Mike Macnair will start to look at the 1924 draft program to Comintern, which is what it was called, which was adopted not as a party program, but as I understand it, as a short-term electoral program. And then Lawrence Parker will look at the 1939 draft, which reflects, again, the changing position of the CPGB in the run-up to World War II, but also the influence of the SPD's Erfurt program, and perhaps surprisingly, even the influence of Karl Kautsky on those who wrote the draft. So that'd be an interesting aspect to look at as well. So we're starting with Mike. We're doing it chronologically. Half an hour, both of them each, and then we can open up for questions and comments from the floor. Over to you, Mike.
Hi, thanks, Tina. This is the draft program of CPGB to Comintern, published in Communist Review in June 1924, Vol 5, number 2. It's available on the Marxist Internet Archive. It's a little bit complex to find it because what you have to do is go into the Comintern, and then from the Comintern to the sections of the Comintern, and then when you get into the CPGB, you will find a list, among other things, a list of the programmatic documents. This text was framed by the discussion of program at the Fourth Congress of Comintern in 1922. And that is also influenced. There's a document which Lawrence has sent me, but I can't remember off the top of my head where the link is, which is called the Symposium on the Question of Program, which is a PDF of a book. And the book, the Symposium on the Question of Program, has essentially got the 1919 new program of the Russian Communist Party, plus the drafts for the Comintern's program produced by, and for their own programs, produced by the KPD and the Bulgarian Communist Party, plus a couple of Lenin texts. The character of this, there's a significant shift from the programs of the Second International, including actually the RSDLP program. And the shift is that there's substantial elaboration of the theoretical and historical development of capitalism in general, and of imperialism and so on. And that's highly substantially elaborated relative to the actual substantive demands. There's also a very substantial element of conjunctural analysis, particularly in relation to the war, the Treaty of Versailles, the consequences of the war, the Treaty of Versailles. And there was a debate at the Fourth Congress about, quote, transitional demands, which are sometimes also called immediate demands, and sometimes also called the minimum program. The line of Bukharin in this debate was that transitional demands didn't belong in the program, or minimum demands, whatever, immediate demands didn't belong in the program of the party, but should instead be separated off in a document called an action program. and the action program should be liable to revision every 2 weeks or thereabouts in response to what was immediately concerning the masses. The counter line to this, which was offered by Thalheimer, German, on behalf of the German party, was that this would license any sort of opportunism, and what was necessary was to incorporate transitional demands in the main program and tie them to the general principles of the party. The result of this debate, which is the result of this debate, which one can find in, well, it is actually online, but this is John Riddell's Towards the United Front, the proceedings, the verbatim account of the proceedings of the Fourth Congress. It isn't in the older document, Theses, Resolutions, and Manifestos of the Fourth Congresses, First Four Congresses of the Comintern. Yeah. Instead of having we had the introductions from Bukharin, from Thalheimer, and from Kabakchiev, who was the Bulgarian delegate, who is sort of slightly lost to history because he's replaced by other people. But we have that, and then the Russians intervene and say they need to have a recess for them to have a caucus meeting. And the upshot of the caucus meeting then a couple of days later is a resolution proposed by the Presidium and by the Russian delegation, which says that there have to be transitional demands in the main program. So that in essence, Bukharin's line on this question has been temporarily squashed. I say temporarily squashed because the draft program of the Fifth Congress, which is still a draft, and the actual program adopted by the Sixth Congress goes back to Bukharin's original line in relation to this question. Okay, so the consequence of this in the first place is that, as I said, the draft program of the CPGB to Comintern has a large section which is actually just lifted from, well, not exactly lifted, but adapted from the Comintern materials, and which winds up with a set of demands which are Comintern demands. This is at the subhead, the historic crisis of capitalism and the struggle towards communism. This is a list of demands of Comintern. Nationalisation of all land without compensation, the handing over small farms to farmers and operation of the large farms by the state under workers' control, nationalisation of the banks, mines, railways, communications, transport, engineering, shipping, cotton and woolen industries, disarm the bourgeoisie and arm the proletariat, the creation of a proletarian army, navy and civil guard, the abolition of capitalist law courts and the establishment of workers' tribunals, the monopoly of foreign trade, nationalisation of distributive trades and fusion with co-ops which had become state distributive organs, state monopoly of the press, annulment of state debts with allowance to small investors, nationalisation of all building and housing property except small property owned by small tenants. I think that's almost certainly a English mistranslation in 1924 of the original German. Rents to be payable to the state, separation of church and state, nationalisation of all day schools and universities, school leaving age to raise to 18, with equal opportunities for all the children to fullest secular, technical and political education, liberation of the colonies held in military subjection, India, Egypt, etc., and support of colonies liberated against imperialism, whether the liberated countries are proletarian states or not. The question of their proletarian character being determined by the social relations within them, recognition and alliance of the proletarian republic with the USSR. So then, having had that, then we get program of the British section of the Communist International, which contains a fairly long discussion of British development and also a bit of stuff about relations between Britain and its empire, the difficulties. Interestingly told, it's a bit sort of that America is struggling with Britain for possession of her colonies, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, by financial and economic penetration. And British imperialism has been and is the mortal enemy of the social revolution. So now the Communist Party proposes the revolutionary action of the working class, and we get essentially the same list of demands that was the list of capitalist demands, of Comintern demands, with the addition of confiscation of all fortunes over £5,000, and in Britain, abolition of the poor law, state responsibility for the aged over 60, the unfit widows, etc. Free medical service. The creation of economic and political agreements with all countries with a view to peaceful development and exchange of goods, and repudiation of the Versailles treaties. And finally, at number 21, universal simultaneous disarmament. This is not very. So the treaties and the universal simultaneous disarmament are some sort of relic of the pre-war politics of the CP, the predecessors of the CP. Then we get there's a paragraph lost in the transcription from the Communist Review to Marxist Internet Archive, and I suspect actually that there's a subhead and some paragraph numbering lost in the Communist Review publication of the document. But we go into the Labour Party, the Labour government, as having been created by this is the 1923 to 24 Labour government, as being not the product of a workers' offensive, but of a crisis of the bourgeois parties. Then at paragraph 17, we actually get another program of immediate demands. Nationalisation without compensation of mines and railways, workers' control, application of the capital levy to all incomes over 5,000. This is a wealth tax which existed at the time. Cancellation of the national debt, state control of banks rather than nationalisation of the banks, control of foreign trade and state regulation of internal prices, grants and credits to local authorities for the building of houses by direct labour, payment of unemployed relief through the national exchequer, that's as opposed to the poor law, through the trade unions, payment of old age pensions from age 60 without any other qualifications, granting political rights to soldiers and sailors, place them on the same footing as civilians, with the right to refuse to blackleg in industrial disputes, minimum wage based on subsistence minimum, school leaving age to 16 rather than 18 in the Comintern programme, and maintenance on subsistence minimum, elimination of night work for youth under 18, free school meals. So this is much more, this programme for the Labour government is a much more economistic and less sharply revolutionary programme. I should have mentioned in the general program the abolition for the CPGB, the abolition of the monarchy and all hereditary titles. Then step 3, there's mass class struggles, and we get yet a third level of action program, which is for the trade unions, industrial unions, workshop and factory committees, Federation of Industrial Unions with binding power, Joint Council of Unions, Workers' Parties and Cooperatives. This is another way of expressing Soviets for United Action in all campaigns and struggles, reinforcement of the trades councils by district committees and factory committees, creation of a General Council of Workers' Co-ops, Consumers Co-ops, and CWS drawn from the National Conference. Every worker to be a cooperator. So that, in essence, my point here is that this text is characterized by, on the one hand, stuff which is characteristic of the Comintern and the elaboration of analysis of the political situation and of the conjuncture and the large theoretical content of it. This is a product of the Comintern's conception, and it's strengthened, in fact, by Bukharin's later arguments that the program is essentially an element for the instrument for the education of the party membership in theoretical principles. How much discussion is there of this text? Not a whole lot. August 1924 edition of Communist Review, we have criticisms of the draft by Jack Lecky. Who Jack Lecky was, he's a Scotsman with dual citizenship in the United States. Went to the States in 1914 and was an IWW activist, came back to the UK in 1918, was part of John Maclean's Communist Labour Party. Well, he was in the Socialist, first in the De-Leonist Socialist Labour Party, then in John Maclean's Communist Labour Party. Then at the 4th Congress of Comintern, he advocated and joined the unified CP. Then at the 4th Congress of Comintern, he was actually a member of the Presidium of the 4th Congress. So the criticisms from him are sort of to be taken to some extent seriously. Subsequent history, he worked for the Comintern in Berlin for a period of time, and in 1925 came back to Britain for various activities. So Lecky's criticisms are, in essence, there's insufficient perspective on the Labour Party. I think he must have been addressing those criticisms to an earlier draft than the one published, because there's quite a lot about the Labour Party in the draft. Secondly, in relation to the British Empire, he identifies the fact that the even if the colonies are given independence, which the white colonies to a considerable extent had already attained independence, as in practice became clear in 1929, nonetheless, they continue to be dominated by British finance capital. So he's a sort of early theorist in that sense of neocolonialism, as opposed to colonialism proper. On the other hand, he stands for the overthrow of capitalist rule of the empire, but argues that it would be reactionary to break up the empire as an economic bloc because there's high levels of economic integration. I must admit, while I think that Luxembourg was right about Kingdom Poland and German Poland, and the Austrians were right about breaking up Austria-Hungary. I'm not persuaded in relation to breaking up the British Empire. And finally, that there needs to be a program of immediate demands, which There is. It's just that there are three separate ones following Bukharin's approach of action programs. Um, in the same issue, W. Solomon from Northwest, I don't know whether that's Northwest London or the Northwest altogether, says the program is too long, needs to be written in clearer language so that it can be understood by any worker, radically simplified, which of course is a story which we've heard uh, more recently. I make three general points. The first, as I said, the excessive amount of historical and conjunctural analysis is a product of the new norms of the Comintern in constructing programs. In point of fact, within the discussion at the Fourth Congress of Comintern, there was internal critiques of the excessive length, in particular of the German draft. Um, and the need to be more concrete. So this is something, as I said, which has grown out. It has the consequence that the draft is obsolete by the late 19, even if they'd gone on to adopt it, it's obsolete by the late 1920s. And the same is, which is something which Jack Conrad has said about the British Road, that each iteration of the British Road has too much conjunctural analysis of what's the immediate situation and in consequence is obsolete almost as soon as it's published. Secondly, the dictatorship of the proletariat is conceptualized simply as Soviets. As I said, the abolition of the monarchy is number 16 in the General Party program, abolition of the monarchy and of titles of honor, but not formally. Um, the abolition of the House of Lords as such as an institution of parliament isn't there. Arm the proletariat, disarm the bourgeoisie. I've said before in relation to this in Fourth Congress of it's from the Fourth Congress of the Comintern. The problem with it is that it is it's empty in content. So how do you arm the proletariat, disarm the bourgeoisie? There are, in fact, um, in the action program for Labour, the demand for political rights for soldiers and police officers, political and trade union rights for soldiers and police officers, which is an important element in arming the proletariat and disarming the bourgeoisie. In fact, however, the three the program of the Comintern, the program of CPGB, the action program for Labour, the action program for trade unions, there are inconsistencies among these, and they're not inconsistencies which are just sort of toning down or omissions. So this layering of the it's already Bukharin's proposal about how the program should work, but the layering of the British program produces a level of inconsistency which is quite problematical. And I think that's all I'm going to say about it. We may come back to the question of how far the demand for Soviets is an adequate way of expressing the question of the dictatorship of the proletariat. That's it.
Thank you, Mike. Yes, I think we might get to that in the discussion. Thank you. Lawrence, over to you for your introduction.
Okay, thanks, Tina. I suppose I'm going to follow on from Mike somewhat in the sense I'm briefly just going to talk about before we get to the 1939 draft program, just a brief, very potted history of the CPGB's efforts on programs after the 1924 one that Mike has talked about. I think you would have to say, if you were going to characterize it, or when I look at it, the CPGB, the confusion and the problematic nature of the CPGB's programs followed on after um, the 1924 draft. When the CPGB was in the Labour Party in the mid 1920s, fighting to stay inside the Labour Party, fighting to differentiate itself from the Labour, the pro-British state Labour left, as it was then. When it was doing that, it had something called the Left Wing Programme, which is a specific programme that it pitched at Labour Party members in the 1920s. That did actually encompass what we would probably understand as some more minimum kind of demands, in the sense that quite a lot of the demands in the left wing program, what it was actually trying to do was it had to differentiate the CPGB from the pro-state Labour Party and the pro-state Labour left. And so there was a number of demands in there about the abolition of the monarchy, democratic rights for soldiers and sailors, etc., that were precisely designed to do that, perform that process of differentiation. And the CPGB did have some success with this kind of program in its conceptions, when James Maxton and Arthur Cook were in also found themselves in opposition to the Labour right in the late 1920s. It was kind of apparent that it was the anti-British state, anti-monarchist kind of left-wing program that had won influence over them in their own document from 1928. So it wasn't that the CPGB couldn't actually grasp a reason like minimum demands. It's not that they couldn't do that, and it was always in the kind of picture. But what you then find really is a long history of like fudge, really, on all of these issues. When the CPGB chose to break up the national left-wing movement and leave the Labour Party in the late 1920s, it actually made a big thing about ditching the left-wing program and its more advanced political demands, and the idea that you'd engage with advanced workers. And what it tended to put the accent on, and what the CPGB thought it was doing, is that it could go to the mass of the working class with very immediate kind of demands around economic and very immediate political kind of contingencies that they were dealing with. In that way, this was the theory during the third period. In that way, this was the way in which you could undermine a Labour Party, by which point the CPGB saw as social fascist. It was a very left, but underneath that kind of very leftist kind of line, you had a whole accent on very workaday, immediate kind of demands, and it was getting the workers to move into struggle around their immediate economic existence, which was deemed to be the path to success for the CPGB. Didn't work, of course. When you go into the 30s and you look at things like well, in the late 1920s, there was Class Against Class, which was actually an election program. Again, you had quite a lot of blood-curdling demands around things like a revolutionary workers' government, but this was interlarded with an immediate program, and it wasn't even an immediate program in a kind of transitional kind of sense that Mike has described to you. The accent was on a very reformist kind of immediate kind of demands. Also, for Soviet Britain was the 1935 program of the CPGB. There's a lot of confusion that exists around this for Soviet Britain, Because while it was introduced and packaged as a program, actually, when the CPGB member Robin Page-Arnott wrote the political introduction to that, very short introduction, he claimed that it wasn't actually the CPGB's substantive program, which was the program of the Comintern. He claimed for Soviet Britain was a kind of again an immediate action program to serve the immediate kind of needs of the working class. So there's a lot of, so when you read for Soviet Britain, it's not immediately clear what it is, and there's a lot of confusion about the way the party packaged it and presented it. Also, as we go into the Popular Front period of the late 1930s, I don't have very much time to explain all this, so I'm having to take it as read that comrades know what these kind of shifts mean. When you go into the Popular Front period, which was when the CPGB pursued much tamer politics, which was basically the nub of which was that they would align themselves with anybody in British politics, whatever their politics were, if they were prepared to countenance a peace front with the Soviet Union, which meant that the CPGB pursued some very respectable figures in British society, didn't become a respectable party, but they were certainly in pursuit of it. But the accent also in this period, and again, this was explained by CPGB leaders on a number of occasions, is that you don't want to overcomplicate political demands. We don't want to go back to the old left-wing program. We want to downplay all this, and we want to put immediate demands that workers, shopkeepers, the middle classes, Uncle Tom Cobley and all can all unite around and go forward on. So basically, up until 1939, you've got a very, a very pronounced history of like fudge and confusion, and the earlier fudge that Mike, I think, has explained to you, that kind of carries through. But the main accent on this is really, if we're going to build the CPGB into like a mass organisation, its immediate demands. And so therefore, as we go up towards the opening of the Second World War, you find the CPGB campaigning on the most immediate, sometimes political issues of the day, but they're just purely like an anti-Chamberlain kind of government kind of force. And as I say, casting around for anybody who was willing to countenance the idea of, a popular front with the Soviet Union. That is a very short and potted history of the CPGB's programmatic history up until then, and it's very inadequate. So, I'd advise people to do their own reading and check that out. The CPGB we're describing in 1939 was a very peculiar organisation and a very odd Janus-faced, I describe it in the article that I put around. It's a very strange organisation with pulls towards revolutionary Marxist politics and to the politics of reformism and respectability. So there's a massive contradiction at work in the CPGB at this point, and that finds a lot of reflection in the very strange document that I think is the 1939 draft program, which is very peculiar. And it is also the way I think about it. Really, it's almost like two programs in one, in essence, and I'll explain why. But just very quickly, again, just to explain something about the CPGB in 1939, just as this draft program is being launched in the autumn of 1939. There is some debate among historians. Lots of historians say that it wasn't launched or that it was aborted. This program was launched. There was a 17-part article in the Daily Worker that introduced the program. There was also a pamphlet which sold thousands of copies amongst party members. And also it was pitched for the 1939 Congress, which was cancelled, and the CPGB said that this was because of dislocation due to the war and the fact that they couldn't find a Congress hall. I don't know how true that is. What I think is more likely, I don't think once this program had been launched, while this program was being launched, the CPGB itself was undergoing a huge shift in its terms of its kind of war line. When the war was first announced, um, when the war was first announced, the CPGB called for the removal of the Chamberlain government, but they looked forward to a progressive kind of war, and they were willing to support an anti-fascist war at least, and that's why they called for the removal of the Chamberlain government, because for all intents and purposes, the CPGB found Chamberlain's government, or characterized Chamberlain's government, particularly as the years went on, particularly into 1940 as well, as a kind of incipient kind of fascist kind of government itself. So that was the initial reaction. Harry Pollitt wrote a very famous pamphlet called "How to Win the War," which kind of emphasised these themes of turning the war against Nazi Germany into a progressive war. But then, unfortunately, for the comrades who'd written all this stuff and argued this stuff, the Soviet Union suddenly signs the Non-Aggression Pact with Nazi Germany in autumn 1939. And as soon as the Soviet Union signed that Non-Aggression Pact, it characterizes the Second World War as an imperialist war and as one that cannot be supported. So basically, the CPGB had to change its line. The change of line was overseen by its ideological leader, Rajani Palm Dutt. Pollitt was removed and sacked as General Secretary because he carried on and arguing the old line about a progressive kind of pursuing progressive anti-fascist war. The editor of the Daily Worker, J.R. Campbell, John Ross Campbell, he was sacked. And also Willie Gallagher, the party's only MP at that point from West Fife in Scotland, he also disagreed with the change of line that the war was imperialist, but it was deemed to be too embarrassing to have your party's only MP as being against your line, and he was actually allowed to effectively hide his opposition, whereas actually Pollitt and Campbell had to write humiliating mea culpas apologies in the party press. So this is the CPGB. The CPGB is in a degree of turmoil at the top of the organization. However, the CPGB, the amazing thing about the CPGB in 1939 was that this didn't manifest itself in large-scale splits. And even though Dutt removed Pollitt as the leader of the CPGB, he made it very difficult for any alternative general secretary to appear in Pollitt's place. So there were elements of kind of continuity. But yeah, this was an organization that was very in turmoil. But it did launch the draft program, but it did also abandon the draft program, although you can see the influence of the draft program appear through its later work in things like the People's Convention, which I don't need to have time to go into. The program itself was a very, as I say, a very strange document, in the sense that there was part of this document, the 1939 draft, which the CPGB, when it wrote about it and it introduced it in its theoretical magazines, Robin Page-Arnott in particular, he recommended the study of various documents that the CPGB had studied, he said, to write the program. And it's a familiar kind of list, manifesto of the Communist Party, also the Erfurt program of the German SPD, and which he recommended as being used for many years as a model by parties in other countries of Europe. And he also recommended the Erfurt influenced 1903 program of Russian social democracy that Lenin was involved in. But we also have we also have we also have even more clearer documentation from Palm Dutt's wife. She was called Sam Pakala Dutt, and she wrote to Harry Pollitt about Harry Pollitt didn't like the program, and she wrote to him about what had gone on, and she said. She basically argued to Pollitt that the draft was a compromise between two different conceptions, a more political program and also a more immediate program. And the program itself was a compromise and it had two different elements. But then she said for 1939, which is a very strange comment, and I'll read out the quote from her that she wrote to Pollitt. She says, "As you will remember, I spoke of a short, simple, business-like document of not more than 7,500 words, something like the old Erfurt program or the Russian program, but of 1903, putting forward our demands in all spheres and preceded by a concise, up-to-date argument, including explanation of the party. This is to be accompanied later," she wrote, "by an extremely popularly written commentary or explanatory booklet similar to Kautsky's Class Struggle, 1892, or Bukharin's ABC of Communism, 1920. So this is a very peculiar. In 1939, the show trials have occurred in the Soviet Union. Both Kautsky is long a despised figure in terms of the Russian Bolshevism as it developed under Stalinism. Kautsky became an unperson, and the influence on influence of German social democracy on the Russian Bolsheviks was missing from the Stalin's history of the Bolsheviks, which had just appeared in English. So that the German influence, the influence of Erfurt, the influence of the minimum maximum program had all been written out. Bukharin is somebody who'd been shot as a traitor to the Soviet Union. He really was an unperson. So these weren't things that obviously Pakala Dutt would voice in public. But so what she's actually saying is that these people and these works were influencing the draft program of the CPGB in 1939, which when you read it, is obvious. That's very obvious from that kind of draft. What you have here is a kind of subterranean intellectual history of the CPGB, in which a lot of the figures involved in the CPGB, very obviously, as Mike alluded to as well, they grew up under the Second International, and it's clear from reading between the lines that Palm Dutt was rather a fan of Kautsky in the same way that Lenin was a fan of Kautsky, and Palm Dutt even used the same phrase as Lenin, that he liked Kautsky when he was a Marxist. Similarly, obviously, Pakala Dutt doesn't believe that Bukharin is a traitor, which would have been an amazing thing for her to say in public, but this was in private to Pollitt, who wouldn't obviously have breathed a word of this anyway. But how then did the old Erfurt program that you've talked about in this series, how did that actually manifest itself in the 1939 draft? Well, what the actual Erfurt program followed, it followed Engels's kind of advice in his 1891 writings on the old Erfurt program, where Engels argued that the kind of I'm paraphrasing, the crown of democratic demands, the working class fighting for democratic demands, was the demand for a democratic republic. The CPGB draft 1939 the CPGB advocated the replacement of the existing political system, but what it argued for what it called a workers' democratic republic, um, establishing local and district council of delegates, and it was also there was also a sense in the 1939 draft that only the working class could win the battle for democracy, and it was only the proletariat that could ensure democratic rights. And there was also lots of other passages to do with this that I could go through, which I'm not going to read out. And Robin Page-Arnott argued that this section of the 1939 draft showed how the British workers fought and won their democratic rights, but were not able as yet to carry that democratic struggle to complete success. And so there was a lot of writing in the CPGB in this period. Pakala Dutt and Page-Arnott both wrote about Chartism, and that's where a lot of this kind of this emphasis on the working class fighting and being the herald of democratic struggles. This is where this stuff comes from. So you would think from that everything is kind of hunky dory, wouldn't you? And this is all, isn't this wonderful? Well, not really, I have to say, because this is where you begin to come up against both the reality of the draft, the confused draft program, and the reality of the CPGB itself. First of all, within within the draft program also, it was Pakala Dutt who she'd broached the idea of something more immediate to lie alongside the democratic parts of the draft program, and she wanted to have what she called mass agitational kind of demands alongside the more democratic demands. And therefore, what you find is that then in this more immediate mass agitational kind of section of the draft program, you find that the democratic rights that the CPGB had rightly talked about in other parts of the program, these had all been filleted out and boiled down into things that are much more simplistic. And so basically the way the draft, so in this part of the draft program, it's the old kind of story about very incremental short-term demands that would incrementally develop working class consciousness rather than rather than developing working class consciousness through winning the battle for democracy. And you find so in all these sections you find all when the way the Communist Party put it, he said the Communist Party puts forward, this is the way Robin Page-Arnott, he said, the Communist Party puts forward immediate demands as the basis of common struggle now. These demands are something which everyone can fight for right away. In the course of this struggle, the people will be mobilized to overcome the resistance of the monopoly capitalists, and in this way the working class will be strengthened for the further advance to socialism. And the crown of this immediate part of the program was not the Workers' Democratic Republic, which you'd found in an earlier section of the program. It was demand simply for a Labour government. So that effectively you have two programs in one section. You've got this very kind of almost romantic image of the working class winning the battle for democracy. In the other, it's just a heap of mass agitational demands that you can the crown of which is a reformist kind of Labour government. This conception of immediate demands and were fed into the work of the CPGB did around the People's Convention in late 1940 and 1941, where the CPGB called for what it called a people's peace led by a people's government, i.e. a Labour government, and it was a kind of reformist stroke pacifist kind of anti-war kind of line, if you liked, interlarded with kind of economism and kind of trade union politics. It was this conception that won out, and so the draft program did have a history kind of beyond this. The other thing about the whole idea about the CPGB in 1939, you know, leading a workers' revolution that would enshrine political and democratic rights. This is an organization that put uh, uh, report, that agreed with the show trials, and that had agreed with um, the Soviet Union's trampling on any kind of conception of kind of workers' rule or workers' control. So the CPGB wasn't a democratic party. There was no, it was led by a well-entrenched bureaucracy, and there was no way in which the British working class could capture the CPGB for revolution. It would be, even though it was like a thoroughly proletarian kind of party in terms of its social composition, although it did have some intellectual members, obviously. But it was in the main, it was a proletarian party in composition. There was no way in which such an organization could really actually make this kind of work, and especially in the labour movement, the British labour movement of the 1930s, when organisations such as the ILP, which I'm not particularly keen on organisations like that, but organisations such as the ILP had broadcast to the labour movement exactly what had been going on in the Soviet Union. Trotsky's writings were well known in the British labour movement. There's no way actively, really, the CPGB could campaign how could that sort of organization realistically lead for a workers' democratic republic? I mean, it'd be the same as, how could the SWP in Britain today lead a struggle for a workers' democratic republic? I mean, it's just, you think about it and it becomes absurd, but the CPGB even more so, actually. So there was a sense in which that struggle for, as I say, the democracy and the work democratic republic, that has to be a non-starter. There's no way the CPGB can kind of follow through on that. I'm coming to the end now, so I'm just going to finish up. So what I think this kind of shows, though, is that what a strange organization the CPGB was in 39 and 1940. Very odd. On one level, you've been had through the Popular Front era, this pull towards respectability, but on the other hand, the CPGB's being influenced and showing the heritage of where it came from in the Second International, and it's in a sense, it's almost quite, daring to actually show off show off its kind of reliance on the Erfurt program, which in the communist world of that kind of period was like was just like a forgotten document mostly, and a forgotten legacy. But the CPGB wanted to kind of parade the influence of German social democracy at a time when that was very unfashionable to do, when it had largely been written out of the Soviet narratives. You have that level of weirdness kind of going on, and in the sense that the CPGB never quite forgot where it came from, and that carries on after the Second World War. Whenever the CPGB is dealing with big political issues, it very, very often drew on examples from the Second International, from experiences that comrades had within Hyman's kind of various organizations, the Social Democratic Federation. It was an organization that looked back to William Morris, etc., etc., etc. There was always this. So yeah, if you look at the way the CPGB dealt with the fallout of 1956, Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin and the invasion of Hungary. It went back to these, and it went back to this history of the Second International. As soon as Stalin kind of died, all this stuff kind of mushroomed out back out again into the open, and it's very kind of strange, and it's very kind of weird to kind of see that. The other thing about the CPGB as well is that despite what I'd probably class it as, right centrism or centrism being in between revolution and reform, but the CPGB definitely erring to the kind of right. That would be my characterization of it in a kind of nutshell. But within that, the CPGB, there were parts of the CPGB's existence that weren't rightist at all when the Second World War started, and the CPGB thought that it was going to come under the eye of the state, which indeed it did, with the banning of the Daily Worker and various kind of state disruptions to it. It planted illegal presses all over London and prepared to go under and prepared for an underground existence. And it was the work that they did was very impressive. You can read all about it in Douglas Hyde's I Believed, which is Douglas Hyde was a kind of a guy who became a Catholic who wrote a book about his experiences under communism in the Communist Party of Great Britain and on the Daily Worker. And actually, the CPGB actually comes out of some of it, not all of it, but some of it quite well. So the CPGB was a very strange organization. And yes, the CPGB was an organization later in the Second World War that once the Soviet Union had entered the war on the side of the Allies and the side of Britain, the CPGB flung itself into support for the imperialist war. Okay, and it was not a great chapter in the party's history, not a particular kind of glorious one. But while it was doing this, while it was basically reducing itself to an organization that called for a second front in the West to help the Soviet Union, while it reduced itself to that sort of kind of politics, at the same time, the CPGB's rank and file enthusiastically spied for the Soviet Union and and were willing to kind of break the law and betray, and they weren't. There was not much bones about betraying the British state. They didn't think there was anything much to kind of betray. And then you have this very peculiar dynamic later on in the war, where the CPGB pulls in thousands and thousands of people who are basically just fairly low-level supporters of the fairly low-level cheerleaders for the Soviet Union and not particularly communist. Within that period, then you get the CPGB members burying themselves in and feeding back intelligence in numbers and important intelligence back to the Soviet Union. But what I'm trying to get at with this is I'm not trying to put a tick or a cross against kind of any of this in particular. What I'm trying to just show you is what a strange, weird organization I think the CPGB actually was during the Second World War. And you can read a lot of that strangeness. It's almost implied in the 1939 draft program. That's it. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Lawrence, and thank you very much, Mike, for two really good introductions on that subject. And comrades, if you have a question, if you have a comment, please raise your hand and I can make you a panelist to ask your question. I'm going to start with a couple of questions to get the ball rolling. Maybe starting with you, Lawrence, because you just spoke, and I think you explained very well, how the confused nature of the party then reflected itself in the confused nature of this program. So reading your article in the run-up to this session, I was also struck by the section on dictatorship of the proletariat, which is very interesting because it also goes back to Erfurt and much closer to the democratic republic kind of thinking. Just read it out quickly because it is quite a nice passage. He's going to talk about the new socialist state will be a vast extension of democracy for the overwhelming masses of the people, but it will be a dictatorship against a handful of exploiters. Such a dictatorship will guarantee the freedom of the people. So long as the struggle against capitalism and against the survivals of capitalism has to be fought, such dictatorship remains necessary. In proportion as socialism is realized, workers' democracy becomes the democracy of the entire people. Slightly confused as well, but it is much closer to the sort of the struggles that Marx also wrote about. And we've been looking at Citizen Marx as well as a book, and Bruno Leipold goes through this in quite some detail about those kind of discussions that we're having on the Democratic Republic as well. Were there then sort of factional struggles on that question between, Erfurtians and those who were, you're looking at the Labour government as a government, do you think, or is it more like they try to square a circle, or were these factions being fought, these battles fought quite openly? Because there are, as you said, two different aims, isn't it? A Labour government is a different aim to a Democratic Republic of the workers.
Not open, not factions in the sense that we would understand a factional centres. It wasn't a hard factional struggle. But what I would say is that there's a submerged tensions when you read, it's actually the woman, Sam Pakala Dutt, who is actually the intellectual powerhouse of this organisation, not a husband who's commonly thought, and not Pollitt. Pollitt wasn't an intellectual powerhouse. Pollitt was more pitched himself as your Lancastrian kind of working class boilermaker. That was his kind of shtick, and didn't pitch himself as a theoretician. But it was a submerged kind of thing. And when you read her letters, which I have done, they're in the CPGB archive, she talks about the way she expresses it is not in a factional kind of sense, but she talks about a tension between theory, the pursuit of ideas, and the ideas which she fed into her husband's books. Rajani Palm Dutt wrote long treatises on various kind of things. She says that there's always been a section of the party, a workerist section of the party, that hates all of that and that's anti-intellectual. And she says at one point, our pamphlets are pathetic. They only appeal to 7-year-olds, whereas actually shop girls can actually understand more than this. So there was this submerged intellectual kind of tension, but it wasn't really a factional kind of struggle. But I mean, and it was all in bloody code. All this stuff has to be coded. So in the early 1930s, just about the point in which Kautsky's really is becoming an unperson for the Soviet, when he'd already kind of become that. But when Stalin starts to move against historians, starts to move against anybody who wants to investigate the Second International, Palm Dutt reproduces all this stuff, but then in the editorial in an issue of Labour Monthly, he'll put positive references into Kautsky. I think he's flicking the two fingers there, because Palm Dutt was also, I think Palm Dutt was also really a fan of Trotsky as well before his kind of downfall. Now, it's not that Palm Dutt was like a public opponent of any of this kind of stuff, because he wasn't. Actually, you'd have to say, very sadly, and Pakala Dutt and Pollitt, they were toadies about Stalin. They weren't. But from Palm Dutt and Pakala Dutt, I get a sense in which they never threw off their Second International heritage, and that they wanted to preserve the best of the movement and the best of what was done, very kind of old-fashioned conceptions, which is almost impossible under Stalinism. So not really factions, but we're talking about submerged things, and you have to like dig all this shit out and spend far too long reading it, like I have, I suppose. But yeah,
makes for a good article, though. I recommend comrades read it. It's very entertaining. Mike, to you now, because it was interesting. You've been also and Lawrence, we've both been talking about short-term economistic demands as opposed to political demands, and Can you just describe? I mean, we are, as communists, we're not against economic demands, are we? We want to improve the workers, raise those demands themselves. We don't dismiss demands for, you know, higher wages, better working conditions, etc. Is the point that it has to be linked to a maximum program, that it has to be linked to political demands, or are there demands, you think, economic demands that by themselves, if they're so short-termist, you know, do they actually become a problem if it's obsolete next week? How do you see the relationship between, you know, the different parts of our program?
Yeah, my understanding of this, this is just me. Yeah, it's the essence of Marx's critique of Proudhonism, Bakuninism, etc., Marx's alternative politics, that the way the working class takes power in order to take over the society as a whole is through winning political democracy. Yeah. And the reason I made this point in my review of uh, Bruno Leipold, there are two reasons why we should agree with that and not with the alternative lines, one or other of the alternative lines. The first of which is that actually, the Soviet Union demonstrates to us that you can't do economic planning without political democracy. Because if you don't have political democracy, and in this I mean something rather stronger than just having votes, if you don't have open democracy, transparency, defenses against victimization of dissenters, the consequence is that the guys who are in managerial posts or who are in administrative posts in the state just lie in order to keep their jobs. And then the consequence of people lying in order to keep their jobs is you haven't got accurate information in order to decide whether things are working or not. And the history of the failure of the Soviet economy, we've got enormous amounts of stories of this sort, some of them completely fucking nutty. You satisfy the plan to build a ton of nails in this month by building a 1-ton nail, which what the hell uses a 1-ton nail, and so on and so on. But in reality, that's actually not just true of the Soviet bureaucracy. It's also true of the SWP's bureaucracy, that people tell lies about how many people they're recruiting. The district organizers are all appointed by the centre. They aren't responsible to the membership in the locality, but to the centre. They tell lies to the centre about how many people they're recruiting and how successful everything's going in order to keep their jobs. And then the centre becomes incapable of deciding, is the SWP actually got 7,000 members or is it really only 1,200 or thereabouts? And a whole series of questions of that sort. So step one is that. Step two is the other side of it, which is to say that in the actual workers' movement, this regime of undemocratic bureaucratic control, this Stalinist style regime, which renders the plan useless in the Soviet economy, is radically demobilizing, which we can see, in fact, in this secret negotiations in the Corbyn scheme. This stuff is endless, but it's also true of the control by the union centres, trade union centres, is demobilizing in terms of the ability of branches to organise, because you can't act, because the funds are all taken into the centre and they aren't held in the locality. You can't act. You can't organise effective shop stewards committees and things like that. And for that matter, the TUC, people talk about Soviets, etc., but the starting point of the idea of Soviets is trades councils. The TUC has shut down the trades councils for all practical purposes by taking strong central bureaucratic control. And the result is, although the TUC theoretically wants there to be trades councils in every town, in reality, what's the fucking point of setting up a trades council if you can't do anything with that which the apparatus doesn't agree to? You can't mobilize without political. So the political democracy stuff comes first. And the problem, in essence, is that Lawrence has referred to the House of Helk and the CPGB argue for a democratic republic as the alternative to capitalist rule in 1939 after the Moscow trials. But the reality, actually, that's already true. People are already saying it's anti-democratic bureaucratic dictatorship as a result of the rigging of Soviet elections in summer 1918 and the Red Terror against the left SRs. It was perfectly clear in the Congress of Soviets in October, November 1917, the left SRs were the majority party. They tolerated, they accepted a Bolshevik majority government from outside because they didn't at first want to take responsibility for the government. They went into government. It was the left SRs which meant that there was actually a majority, which meant that it was possible to dissolve the Constituent Assembly. But so then the Bolsheviks surrendered at gunpoint to the German Western Front, the German Field Army, German Eastern Front Field Army in Brest-Litovsk. Okay, surrendering at gunpoint is it's a sensible thing to do, and sometimes you have to do undemocratic things because you're in a hole, as they are in a hole. It's not the fact that they do that, but that they then say, oh, we've got to suppress the democracy of the Soviets in order to do that. And then not just even that they suppress the democracy of the Soviets, but that they then, at Second Congress of the Comintern, they produce a theory according to which the working class is necessarily politically represented by its advanced part. And then going along with that at Third Congress, the party is necessarily represented by its advanced part, which is the Central Committee. The Central Committee is necessarily represented by its advanced part, which is the Politburo. The Politburo is necessarily represented by its advanced part, which is Comrade Lenin. And then we have a power struggle about who's going to succeed Comrade Lenin, and it winds up being Comrade Stalin. But it becomes the case that you can no longer persuade, you can't win over the supporters of the German social democracy in circumstances where the Bolshevism represents itself as anti-democratic. So they try and find a way round that. They try and go round the question of democracy, essentially by conning the working class into taking power by the idea that it will throw up Soviets as a result of its class struggle, and then the party will take the lead in the Soviets by being the best fighters for the transition demands. Transitional demands, and that's an attempt to dodge round the problem that the communism has identified itself with anti-democratic politics, and that's where this debate about transition demands at the Fourth Congress comes from. That's it.
Thanks, Mike. Lawrence, do you have anything to say on that issue, or shall I ask? Okay, you're muted, but I see you shaking your head. I think that's a no. Okay, Ken, please.
Right, thank you very much, Mike and Lawrence. My question is mainly for Lawrence. Lawrence, towards the end of your presentation, you mentioned the undemocratic nature of the 1939 party. To what extent did the members of the party speak out against that, write against it, attempt to organize against it? Did a significant number of them leave the party? And if they did so, did they try to form other groups, or did they join other organizations? And how did the composition and membership of the CPGB evolve post 1939, and how had that changed by the time the end of the war came? So, thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Do you want to answer that, Lawrence?
Yeah. In terms of the undemocratic nature of the party in 1939, well, did members organise against it or argue against it? Not particularly. You can find there was a CPGB journal in the late 1930s called, I think it was called Discussion, and you can read some bits and pieces in there, but there was no like factions in the CPGB. The era of the unofficial factions really was in the post-war kind of period, which is when these unofficial groupings inside the CPGB really mushroomed. I think what when it did become, but what when it when all this stuff did become apparent, and that was a lot later, I think, in 1956, because in 1956 the complaints, the Khrushchev's critique of Stalin unleashed a kind of tidal wave of complaints inside the CPGB, some of which are reasonable, some of which were kind of like attacks on stuff like democratic kind of centralism. But if you read there was a party commission on internal democracy, and that actually did reveal like a wide degree of dissatisfaction, also sometimes from the leadership itself and from sections of its local leaderships about the democracy of the party. There was a whole heap of complaints, and if you read the document that the 57 Commission produced, its critique of some of the methods of what had happened inside the CPGB went back to the 1930s. The leadership didn't want to change anything too fundamental, but they were critical of their past practices, and there was a kind of sense in which the party needed to change. But the things that came up, and within that 57 document, there was a majority report and a minority report. Both the majority and the minority report and the people who expressed reservations brought up a great deal. One of the things that was criticised like very deeply, for example, was the practice of the recommended list, where you have, as you probably know, Ken, in left organizations, the sitting leadership will always give a recommended kind of list. And actually, what was kind of interesting about this debate is the CPGB had used that in a very closed fashion, where the leadership would you have a slate of candidates, and you can only vote for the slate of candidates. That the leadership, you have to renounce the slate as a whole. The CPGB leadership had run that in the 30s, and that was criticised and widely denounced. But they tried different panel systems, regional systems, voting for single members. The CPGB tried pretty much all of them, like down the years. But also as well, I think it was probably when you got the real complaints, there was another wave of complaints that came it was more at the end of the Second World War as well, when members, and this was a widespread criticism, there was a big rank and file rebellion at the end of 1945. by people who were more kind of leftists. They complained about the dilution of communists inside the organization. But one of the big complaints in 1945 and the 1945 Congress was the way that the leadership just announced policy on the hoof without any pretense of discussion. And the big thing that was a criticised was the fact that as the Labour Party was about to win the general election a few months before, the CPGB was still campaigning for a coalition with Churchill, and the mechanisms of that are also the mechanisms by which the party dealt with Earl Browder and what had happened in the American Party. Earl Browder had this kind of theory, which came to be known as Browderism, that because the Soviet Union was in alliance with Roosevelt and Churchill, you could actually replicate that in your home countries, and you didn't really need a communist party. You just needed an association. That was really that caused when the CPGB started to inflict this line on the daily worker, and they called Browder like Lenin in 1944. That was the headline of one of the articles, which is kind of fairly laughable. But again, the mechanisms by which these things were announced and which the rank and file didn't have any say on this. But it came to kind of life at the end of the First World War. Then it kind of fades again and it kind of explodes in 56. But the factions, really, the factional life of the CPGB, when the Maoists, the pro-Soviets, and all the various collection of informal factions, that was kind of later, and they were less good on some aspects of the democratic function of the CPGB normally when they were getting expelled, funnily enough. But in general, they didn't have a great critique of the internal workings of the CPGB. So yeah, it floated around, but this is an organization that factions were banned. You know, if me and you were in different branches in the CPGB in 1939, I wouldn't be allowed to talk to you. You wouldn't be allowed to talk to me. You know, it was horizontal communications through the leadership only. So yeah, it's an interesting question, but it wasn't in the kind of factional sense that we would. It was kind of more rumblings which exploded at the end of the Second World War and then really absolutely lit a flame in 56 when the whole movement was in crisis.
Thank you.
Rafal, please.
Good evening, comrades. Thank you for the interesting talk. My question is, again, primarily for Lawrence. So you explain that the 1939 program has these sort of two souls in it, contradictory. One, this sort of Erfurtian-inspired program of demands, and then one that's this reformist conception. And not to unduly extend the topic of the discussion to post-war, but how do you see that developing then in the subsequent programs in 49 and 51? Do you see basically the British Federal Socialism as the latter reformist conception fully winning out, and the Erfurtian being abandoned, or is there still some trace of that Second International heritage in the subsequent programs of the CPGB? Thank you.
Thanks, Rafal. I think you could both answer that if you want, but who wants that?
Okay, I can start. Well, I'm quite happy, quite happy for Mike to talk as well. Two souls is a good way of putting it, Rafael, actually. But I see the Labour Party one as winning out, but and I don't. The positive references in the more theoretical kind of life of the CPGB to the old Second International, that the Second International gets more and more kind of talked about, the kind of older like Palm got, and the more at odds he became with the he kind of fell out really with the not publicly, of course, with Palm Duck because nothing was done in public, but he kind of fell out with the leadership as it evolved through the 1960s, and he wasn't very keen on the CPGB distancing itself from the Soviet Union. But he wrote a very interesting book towards the end of his life called The Internationale, which I think was in '63. Uh, um, and actually, in some ways, it is very interesting and it's a very well written. And then before people start throwing things at me for that, there was quite a lot of people who admired it who weren't of his ilk. Eric Hobsbawm reviewed it very positively, the International book. But the International goes back to that, and it looks and it tries to deal with this question of the Second International. So intellectually, the Second International, it continued as a kind of subterranean kind of existence that it already kind of had. In terms of the program, I think it's the reformist, labourist kind of conception that wins out. But I think it wins out for a very specific reason, which I haven't really talked about. The British road to socialism, as it was conceived in 51, was really a way in which the CPGB could be of use to the Soviet Union. And what I mean by that is by the late 1940s and 50s, Stalin and the CPSU were not interested in the British Revolution whatsoever. But what the CPGB's two MPs and the group of crypto-communist Labour MPs had done in the 45 government, what they'd actually done very usefully for Stalin and the Soviet leadership was to voice the foreign policy concerns of the Soviet Union in capitalism's second 11 and in the houses of parliament and in the corridors of power. And so that even though it was a very modest kind of thing, there's a way in which the CPGB could be useful to the Soviet Union. And so the British road to socialism, with its kind of conceptualism of a kind of a Labour government friendly to the Soviet Union under the friendly guidance of a group of communists. That was all theorizing really what had actually happened and the way the CPGB had been useful to the Soviet Union. This had started in the mid-30s when they'd entered the party secretly in some numbers, basically to campaign for the Popular Front inside the Labour Party. So that's why it won out, because it was practically useful. The kind of tragedy of this is, even though the British road to socialism wielded a lot of influence for many, many years on the Labour left, to this day, really, the actual practical part of that program was a dead letter by 1951 because the pro-Soviet Labour MPs had been dealt with by Attlee, and the CPGB didn't have any MPs after 1951, and the Labour Independent Group of Pritt and others that they'd all lost their seats and gone out of existence pretty much. So that was the tragedy of the BRS. It was dead as soon as it was written in 51. It was relaunched after that election 51 where that block had unraveled. But that's why it won, really. It wasn't, I don't think the British road to socialism won out because of any great theoretical kind of conception, because it doesn't have a great theoretical conception. But what it was trying to rationalize, what would be useful to the Soviet Union and how could the CPGB be useful if it wasn't leading a British revolution? That's what it was trying. It was a reformist program to deal with that. That's why it won, not because of any highfalutin ideals. That's my interpretation of it. Others may have a different one.
Mike, do you want to say something on it? Also, it's interesting as you touch upon, Lawrence, that it does remain actually quite important. And you look at Corbyn and his program, it is a version of the British road to socialism. It's national, it's within the state, etc. It is an extension of what's been going on in the CPGB for some time. I'm sorry, Mike.
Yeah, no, I was just going to make actually the point you've just made, Tina.
Sorry.
Lawrence, you said that it's dead in the water as a strategy for the CPGB to actually influence Labour. But actually, the old CP does succeed in influencing the Labour left with the BRS conceptions all the way through it influences the not exactly Bevan, but it influences. There's a whole sort of pro-Soviet wing of the Labour left, which the dear me, Lawrence, the Pavlovite, there's a wing of the Trotskyist movement which capitulates in 1954 and goes to work with the in the Labour Party, to work with the guys who were influenced by the CP. Whereas Healy was keen on more, well, Bevan in particular, but Healy was keen on the anti-Soviet wing of the Labour left. Healy, you get the strange thing that the Healy organisation, as of 1953, was actually part of the right wing of the Trotskyist movement, which was keen on third campism and anti-Soviet. But then the splits in the Communist Party in 1956 lead them to take an opportunistic turn and recruit a whole load of workers and intellectuals out of the people who split from the CP as a result of Hungary in 1956. And the result is that the SLL shifts sharply politically to the left on the Soviet question and on anti-imperialism and stuff like that. So in terms of me, that it's I don't think it's dead in the water either entirely as a matter of diplomatic usage for the USSR, because the CND, etc., it didn't win, but it was sufficiently capable of being embarrassing to the British government. Okay, the CP doesn't actually succeed in retaining MPs, but that's the logic of the BRS, because why the hell do you, if the BRS basically says what we're aiming for is a left Labour government, which will then be succeeded by a more left Labour government, what the fuck's the point of the CPGB? What we need is a strong Labour left, is the natural conclusion out of that, and the conclusion which was quite widely drawn way back again 70s, 1976, the New British Road. One of the guys who I was a trot at the time, was working with we were working with CPS in the anti-fascist work organised by Oxford Trades Council and the No campaign in the 1974 referendum, which we had the wonderful thing in which King Street denounced the CP as being ultra leftists, and Pentonville Road, which was where Pentonville Road, which was where the IMG office was, denounced us for being ultra leftist, for for failing to put Enoch Powell on the platform for the No campaign. But this guy broke over the 1976 New British Road. I'm not sure why the New British Road was seen as being particularly objectionable, but then why don't you go to some left organisation? He said, well, no, if I'm going to be in a reformist organisation, I should be in a big one. I'd go and join the Labour Party. And I think a lot of people did that, not over the New British Road, but just generally. So the British Road, it has an effect. It's not an effect which is an effect. Either A, it's not a road to revolution, that's clear enough, but B, it's not it's an effect which has some advantages to the Soviet Union, and has some advantages in terms of providing the Labour left with coherent ideology, and also actually in terms of providing the Labour left with an effective striking force in the trade unions, because Burt Ramilson and co. organised effectively broad left formations in trade unions. So I think it's a mistake to suppose it's dead in the water by the time it's adopted, but it is nonetheless. It's not a program for today. Or it's not a program for today. It's not a program for revolution.
Moshe.
I have a question which is tangential to what is being discussed. So please ignore it if you think it is a digression, and perhaps we should discuss it in a different meeting. But can you make any comment about the evolution of the position of the Comintern, especially this is directed to Mike, but also eventually towards anti-colonial movements of national liberation and anti-colonial movements in the programmatic corpus of the Comintern. Has there been any shift, and if so, what was it? That's it.
Thanks, Moshe. If Mike knows the answer.
I think it's a useful point. It is actually already there in Second Congress and the Congress of the Peoples of the East. That the Comintern under Lenin adopts the position that is Lenin's position on the Easter Rising, that the revolution is inconceivable without the large movements of the petty bourgeoisie, and those large movements of the petty bourgeoisie will take the form of national colonial movements. And so one of the things which Bukharin is discussing in the program discussion in 1922 at the Fourth Congress is the legitimacy of the Soviet Union making military alliances and more generally alliances with capitalist countries. And the background to that, of course, is that the Soviet Union, led by Trotsky, had the Soviet Union had allied with Kemal Ataturk to the extent of actually sacrificing the Turkish Communist Party leadership to be murdered by the Ataturkists, and keeping quiet about that. But then it was also the case in when I think it's while Trotsky was still Minister of War, the secret terms of the Treaty of Rapallo essentially provide for the German Krupp and these guys to provide military tech to the Red Army, and the Red Army to provide clandestine support for German rearmament and the Reichswehr. So that I think that's probably where why Bukharin is talking about alliances rather than the Turkish case. I think that's probably what Bukharin is talking about in terms of alliances with bourgeois countries. But the commitment to the victory of the anti-colonial movement and that very sharp line, that's already, as I say, it's in the Congress of the Peoples of the East, it's in Second Congress of Comintern theses on the national colonial question. There's another set of theses on the national colonial question, Third Congress. It's also in the 21 conditions. It's obligatory on which in reality, if you ask the question, what's the real program of the Communist parties? It's not any of these programmatic documents adopted as a result of the Fourth Congress. It's the theses of the first four Congresses, and in particular the 21 conditions. So that yes, that commitment. There's debate which I've never quite been able to disentangle between Lenin on the one side and M.N. Roy on the other side. In the Third Congress, I think it is. But there's something about the question, how far should we be just nationalists, and how far should we be keeping a clear line separating us from the Indian National Congress? Yeah. How far should we present the communists as the best fighters for the national movement? That's also part of Lecky's criticisms of the 1924 draft program, that he says the 1924 draft program fails to take account of the extent to which, once the nationalists have achieved national independence from the British Empire, the subordination to finance capital, British finance capital, is just part of the general subordination to finance capital in general, and therefore, Lecky suggests, in this situation, once the political independence has been achieved, the workers' movement should be pushing towards class against class line, and not continuing to pursue a national unity policy. This, of course, again is linked into the debate which is beginning at this period in 1924, and it sort of runs and becomes a big deal in 1927. Are the Chinese communists right to go into entry in the Kuomintang? In fact, it's sort of, okay, fairly clear the Chinese communists were in fact right to go into entry into Kuomintang, because they go from 50 people to 50,000 within a year or something like that, through entry in the Kuomintang. But are the Chinese communists being unduly friendly to the leadership of the Kuomintang, so that they're going to be stabbed in the back, which turns into being one of the aspects of the debate between the oppositions and the Stalin, Bukharin, Rykov, Tomsky phase of the leadership, and of the development of Trotsky's critique of the Comintern in Third International after Lenin. So all of these things, yeah, but it's there from the beginning. It's not that it's sort of one of the things which they all say, this is part of the decisive break. Bukharin and Thalheimer and the Bulgarian guy introducing the program. The fundamental difference between us and the social democracy is anti-imperialism. That's it.
Thank you, Mike. And please.
Hi, how are we there?
Yep.
Great. Okay. Yeah, a couple of my well, I think the most significant topics, the nature of proletarian power and the attitude to nationalism, both of which separate Stalinism and the international left opposition, which was far from simply Trotskyism. Okay. Let me. I'm going to concentrate on the form, the nature of power. But what Moshe just brought up at the end, is very interesting, I think. I did put a couple of notes in the chat. Hopefully someone will click on the links, but that's up to you. Okay, anyway, the working class cannot come to power by gradually conquering the economy. Hopefully we agree on that. So we can't have an ever-escalating series of reforms within capitalism, which means that it's a very, very tiny step towards establishing socialism at the very end of this process. The nature of capitalism, its crisis-struck nature will not allow that. I think I think it was the 1939 program, but I'm not sure there. But anyway, as I believe one of the 1930s CPGB program says, the bourgeoisie will concede so much to the proletariat, in order to contain it. I think this is entirely dependent on profitability, profit rates, as to how far the bourgeoisie will go. But eventually, in any case, the limit is reached, and the rate of profit has to retain prime importance. The ruling class can only grant so much to the working class, and then it must resort to some form of repression, be that fascism or otherwise. So, agreeing with Mike in many ways, the reality is that the proletariat has to win political power. I think that, you know, Mike emphasised that point over and over again. And I think he's correct to emphasise that point. It has to win the battle for power, or you know, we can say, you know, I think Marx originally said the battle for democracy. But what do we mean by the power of the proletariat? You know, the dictatorship of the proletariat, which I said, you know, we could call it democracy for the proletariat. But how does that differ from you know, the current fig leaf farce of democracy, you know, so-called democracy, which we have now? I mean, if you agree with Marx that you know, the proletariat cannot simply take over the existing state and wield it for its own purposes, you know, the existing state has to be smashed. And if like Mike, you discount the proletariat's own organs, which all these programs advocate vociferously, I believe. You know, all these programs, you know, emphasize, you know, above all, you know, the power of the proletariat's own organs. But Mike, I believe, you know, discounts these, you know, councils, Soviets. But what is left then? So, you know, we've discounted the idea of, you know, taking over the current state and wielding it for our own purposes. We've discounted the formation of our own organs, you know, councils type structures, you know, involving you know, instantly recallable delegates. You know, what is there? What remains? You know, I cannot really see anything apart from, you know, a party dictatorship, and you know, that's the understanding that I get from Jack Conrad, who says that, you know, the working class must rule through the party. So is that the solution that you're advocating? You know, however you word it and veil it, does it come down to a party dictatorship? But you know, or what else? What other formulation do you have? Yes. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks. Comrades, I suggest that perhaps in replying to Ant, but also we could use this now as a summing up, because there's only 10 minutes to go in this meeting. Perhaps a question we could answer is, you know, what can we learn, if anything, from that period, from those drafts, and the British Road to Socialism, perhaps, or on what to do and perhaps what not to do in our efforts to build a real communist party, in our efforts to perhaps get organized in the Corbyn party, should it ever be formed. Mike, do you want to start?
Okay, I'm going to actually, I think the substance respond to Ant, and I respond to Ant with 2 points. You know, and it's addressed to this because precisely one of the issues, this 1924 program draft is precisely an example of how this idea that the way in which power will be achieved is through the self-organized organs of struggle. I think of the party as a potentially self-organized entity, you know, not just the trades councils or Soviets or shop stewards committees or combine committees. Well, 4 trades councils, Soviets, shop stewards committees, combine committees, and so on and so forth. But 2 problems. One, if you have a Soviet structure of government based on the organs of direct class struggle without political democracy, actually, that isn't the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's just a different form of capitalist-style representative democracy. And that we can see actually with what happened to the Russian Soviets. But we can see it equally with the German Räte, the German Workers' Councils in 1919. Yeah. They have workers' councils. They say we have workers' councils without parties. We agreed to have workers' councils without parties. What's the consequence? consequence is the SPD, because it's the existing mass party of the German working class, it dominates the councils through people with not wearing SPD hats, because it would be wrong to have parties, but wearing hats as this sort of trade union official or that sort of delegate and so on and so forth. And Soviets without parties does not allow the sort of political struggles which took place in 1917. But second observation on that, just more generally, actually, is there any other case other than 1917 in which the existing let's call them pro-capitalist workers' parties, because I think it's better to call them that than to call them reformists, have permitted, and trade union bureaucracies have permitted the conception, the sort of Soviets that happened in 1917. No other instance, and that's already a point which is already made by Trotsky in 1923. The Soviets, he says, are the means by which the party makes a relationship with the broad mass of the class, and there is the class organizes in order to take decisions for its struggle and so on and so forth. But after the experience of 1917, the right wing of the social democracy is never going to agree to the creation of Soviets in that sense. And he makes exactly the same point in relation to the left in response to the left in Spain in 1931. We have to find some way in which we address the question of common action, united action with freedom of criticism, but it can't be that we fetishize the Soviet form, because actually what you get if you fetishize the Soviet form is Soviets controlled by the bureaucrats, which you've got Portugal, 1974-76. We got lots of workers' councils. Chile, cordones industriales, but not a political alternative to the Unidad Popular, because political leadership was in the hands of the Unidad Popular. So, yeah, it's what we pose is the question of the democratic republic as the alternative to, and the point about posing it as the democratic republic is that by posing it as the democratic republic, we can present the question of the character of capitalist rule as a regime of corruption. We can present the question of political. Rafal has referred to people's committees in Korea after the Japanese withdrawal. That's a circumstance where the Red Army enters. And in the same way, actually, you get mass mobilizations in Czechoslovakia in 1948-49. It's not simply the Soviet bureaucracy from it on top imposes Sovietization. Same's true in Korea. There's mass support, anti-colonial support, but it's support for the Communist Party, the existing Communist Party, backed by the Red Army. So this is how can we pose the question of workers' power, and the way in which we pose the question of workers' power is through posing the question of the democratic republic, which is a way in which we can pose the question of delegitimizing the bribe-taking MPs, the advertising-funded mass media as a engine of corruption, which forces the MPs to take bribes in order to be able to speak. The sale and denial of justice through the free market in legal services, and the institutional forms of what's called scorched earth litigation policy, scorched earth litigation tactics, the freedom of movement of capital as a means whereby capital can withdraw itself, which is through the deficit funding. So all of the workers' programs involve cancellation of the public debt, which can only happen through nationalisation of the banks and financial services sector. Yeah. So there's a set of demands which together, plus the militia, plus the right to bear arms, plus democratic rights within the armed forces, etc. These are a set of demands which, taken together, concretize the question of arm the working class, disarm the bourgeoisie, concretize the question of take power away from the bourgeoisie, because the way the bourgeoisie rules is through corruption. It's not through the fact that the parliaments are from geographical representation, or that local government is geographical representation. It's actually, again, the Soviets from 1918 is a system of geographical representation. That's it.
Thanks, Mike. Over to you, Lawrence.
Yeah, I'll answer. I'll try and answer what we can learn from this period and looking for these types of things. Well, I think the first thing that I'd say is that you have to study these things, and a reason I say that is because the tendency too often is to put a label on things. You know, the CPGB is Stalinist, and therefore that's all you ever need to know about it. It's not that I don't think the CPGB wasn't Stalinist, or you know, that's not what I'm arguing either. But unless you actually study these things and actually work out the contradictions in these things, and these, the reason I say this is these talks that me and Mike and that me and Jack and Tina hosts, they've been very unpopular with certain TAS leaders who they do want to live in this kind of world where you just label something, and what Militant said in 1983 about the CPGB of that era, that'll do, and that, you know, that for it is. So you actually have to study these kind of things to kind of work them out. Because if I hadn't if I hadn't have bothered studying the 1939 CPGB draft program, I would have never have known that they were actually that they argued internally that they wanted to channel Kautsky's class struggle and Bukharin's ABC of communism, which is a very surprising finding, but nonetheless, it's something that's true, and you have to account for these things that goes beyond the labels. The second thing I think relates to current experience too. I have to preface this: I'm not a program writer, and I'm not an expert by any means on programs really. But what the 39 draft, the thing that strikes me about it is that in some ways, yes, here we have an organization that there's no, as Mike has explained as well, there's no way the CPGB, an organization of official communism in the late 1930s, is seriously going to win the struggle for a workers' democratic republic. That, in terms of the history that's happened, that's quite absurd. But in some ways, theoretically, the CPGB leaders had done the prep work, and the sources that they read were you have to say, well, there with if you were looking for historical sources, if you were writing a program and you were looking to learn from history, did the hard yards and went through certain kind of document. You know, they went through Erfurt, they went through the RSDLP of 1903, they went through the Communist Manifesto. They'd done some of the hard yards. But what they'd done also, but then what they kept doing, this is what I get from programs, they keep mixing in contingency all the time. And so you get this other emphasis around the 1939 program about what are we going to do right now? What can we achieve right now? And their conclusion appears to me to be a bloody Labour government. Right. So this contingency, and again, I'm sorry, I have to go back to a current example, which I've just experienced in TAS. It seems to me that the reason that the program that the TAS leadership have produced is so awful is not just because that they put it through an AI program to make sure that a 12-year-old could read it, and I'm not joking. It's not just that they did that, but it's also that it mixed in with the writing of that program has been a contingency, which is a need to polemicize against the CPGB on the question of transition. And so therefore the program has almost become like a polemical document to kind of subterraneanly win a battle against the CPGB. Now I'm not in favor of debating the transition. I think it's actually been quite interesting, and but I actually think that their program has actually been interlarded with this type of thing, and therefore the types of things that it says about it. You know, the transition. You know, they've put that into the program, and they're concretizing, you know, the immediate measures of socialization, which I just think is absurd. But what's being interlarded with this, it strikes me, is that so then it stops being a strategic document, and then it starts becoming a polemical document. Now there's a sense, and I'm supposing, which programs can cross over into that anyway. That's not unknown, I suppose. But that's what struck me about it. Yeah, the need to actually study history, and then yeah, writing programs. Yeah, immediate action programs overlaying on strategic kind of concerns. I don't think it kind of works. I don't think any of that stuff kind of works. But again, I end this. I'm not a program writer, and I'm not an expert on programs, and you wouldn't put me in charge of writing a program because it would undoubtedly be too flowery, and I'd probably write a play instead or something idiotic like that. But so I end on that. So thanks.
That sounds quite good, actually. A play as a program, the program play. I think that could work. Anyway,
Yeah.
we'll be talking about program in the next few months as part of this series, but also, of course, what's happening in the Corbyn party, etc. And that would be certainly be of interest. If I hear there is a program going around, a draft program, but it is very, very within the framework of what we unfortunately expect. You know, the nation state. It's very British road to socialism, unfortunately. So there's work to be done for communists who have a different perspective on this question, and we'll continue the discussion. Thank you very much, both to Lawrence and Mike, for really interesting openings and discussion, and thanks for taking the time to reply to comrades' questions and contributions. Good night, comrades.
Thank you, Tina, for organising
Cheers.
this.
Cheers, Tina. Yeah.
Yes.
Cheers, Mike.
Bye.